Unfortunately, as a PR professional, you always have to be prepared to handle the worst case scenario. The reality is that all the planning in the world won't guarantee that your company won't face a problem and/or a full-blown crisis. Sometimes a crisis is the direct result of actions a company took or didn't take. As an example, the BP oil spill of 2010 was a direct result of the company's defective cement being used on the well and the direct result of the company's failed attempts to stop the leak. Other times, however, the crisis is due to outside influences. So, even though the company did nothing wrong, it still has to deal with a crisis. For example, Captain Sully Sullenberg's crash landing of U.S. Air Flight 1549 in the Hudson River was the result of birds getting into the plane's engines on takeoff. The company and the pilots did nothing wrong, in fact, did everything right, but they still had to deal with a crisis. In yet other cases, the mishandling of a small problem can grow into a huge crisis. For example, you may recall the U.S. government's lack of preparation for the relief efforts after Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans. And although it's good to know whether a crisis is the result of your company's actions, when you're actually handling the crisis from a PR perspective, it's really not your main concern. Your main concerns are to resolve the crisis, maintain your company's reputation, and to constantly be communicating with all of your key constituent groups. How do you maintain your company's reputation, and how do you effectively communicate with your constituent groups in times of crises? That's what we'll spend the next 2 weeks of this class studying. The first thing you need to understand as a PR professional is that there's a difference between crisis communication and crisis management. In this lesson, we're going to focus on understanding crisis management. Then, during the rest of this week and all of next week, we'll focus on crisis communication. But to start with, let's just define what a crisis is, so that we're all talking about the same thing. Experts Dorley and Garcia define a crisis as a, quote, non-routine event that risks undesired visibility that in turn threatens significant reputational damage, end quote. Therefore, to determine whether something is a true crisis, you'll want to ask yourself 3 questions. Number 1, is it routine? If not, then you could potentially have a crisis on your hands. Number 2, does the situation risk undesired visibility for the organization? If so, then again, we could be dealing with a crisis. And number 3, does the situation threaten to significantly damage the organization's reputation? If your answer to this is also yes, then you do have a crisis on your hands. For this lesson, you'll want to download the Crisis Management Guidebook. The link to the guidebook is available on FSO. You may need to copy and paste the link into your web browser in order to get it to work, though. As you read through the guidebook, you'll notice that the content is not focused exclusively on crisis communication strategies. Instead, it focuses on both crisis management and crisis communications, because the two go hand in hand. As one of your assigned videos for this week says, you can't communicate your way out of something that you behaved your way into. But your job as a PR professional will be to communicate to many constituent groups what's going on and how your company is handling the crisis. However, before you can do that, the company itself has to actually handle and deal with the crisis. So that's what I want you to remember. A real crisis is not just a PR problem. It's a genuine problem that has to be rectified. If you haven't already read it, then please be sure to read Garcia's guidebook, which includes a case study about the untimely death of McDonald's CEO. By all accounts, the company handled the situation successfully. It communicated to the public twice within the first 3 hours of the CEO's death. But the company's successful handling of the situation was not due to the fact that it communicated with the public quickly. Rather, McDonald's success came from handling the situation quickly. The company was able to take immediate action because of a succession plan that had already been developed. McDonald's demonstrated effective crisis management practices by having a plan and taking immediate action to implement that plan. As a result of that effective and swift management practice, the company was then able to communicate a positive message to its constituent groups and thus have effective crisis communication practices too. Planning in advance for a crisis was well worth the time it took up because it allowed the company to handle the crisis effectively from both a management and a communication perspective. Garcia's guidebook also includes some helpful tips for leaders who are managing a crisis. First, he states that you can't assume that you'll be able to manage in bad times the same way you do in good times. Second, he states that you should move through the denial phase quickly and face the hard stuff with your eyes wide open. And third, he states that you should not view crisis management as an interruption of your company's stewardship, but instead should view crisis management as a test of that stewardship. Garcia gives additional pointers in the form of a checklist of 10 items for handling both crisis management and crisis communication. Therefore, you'll want to review his handbook carefully to learn about all the advice he has for dealing with crises. As you can already tell, crisis management is very different from crisis communication, but both are extraordinarily important. Crisis management revolves around solving a problem, and crisis communication revolves around communicating to the public during the crisis and once it's resolved. As a PR professional, your job will likely focus mostly on crisis communication, so for the remainder of our class, that's what we'll be studying. But if you have any questions about the differences between crisis management and crisis communication, then please let your instructor know. Otherwise, you're welcome to move on to your next lesson, which does focus on crisis communication.